folks, welcome to the channel Thinking Theology. You saw the title, Christopher Hitchens, Dismantling Religion in 8 Minutes. So that was the title of the video that I saw. Let's see what he's got to say. Those of you who are new, welcome. The title of the channel, which I'm going to change at some point. I'm pretty convinced I'm going to change it at some point. It isn't about establishing or defending theology. It's just theological topics, whether it's refuting theology, whether it's pro-theology, pro-belief in God. Could be James Webb Space Telescope discoveries about what's going out there on the cosmology and how different folks process that information on a quote-unquote spiritual level or a purely scientific level. But I like to get into the nuances of the debates and just different perspectives. I'm agnostic, so if somebody's a hardcore atheist, it doesn't bother me. If somebody's a hardcore fundamentalist, that doesn't bother me in its own right. How people stand in their opinions when they're just so convinced that they cannot be wrong, that's really annoying, because that means that they're just not really intellectually either honest or curious any longer. So let's see what Hitchens has to say here on the irrationality of organized religion, evidently. Sounded like Rogan.
After a climatic crisis, it's very easy to imagine now something like a titanic volcanic explosion in Indonesia that blotted out the sun, that altered the whole climate against us. It's thought that the species went down to about 5,000. In fact, in other words, before they decided to make the migration north, find somewhere cooler, abandon the savannah for which our bodies are designed. We were 5,000 casualties short of going the way that 98.9% of every species ever found to be present on this earth has already gone into extinction. I'll say it again. Effectively 99% of every species ever on earth has already become extinct, and nearly us, some design.
Well, yeah, all right. He's saying that we're going to see where he goes, but that's also the reason why adaptations generally work against their host. They don't work in favor of them, and there are multiple reasons why, but every so often it's thought that they do work in favor of their host. And evolutionists suggest that that's why we survived. People so far survived.
Some father, some caring God, some designing supervisor.
Yeah.
There is no recourse to a dictatorial authority in this. It's very lucky that we're here. The randomness in that case worked in our favor. Francis Collins, the Christian genome scientist, thinks we've been here maybe 100,000 years. Richard Dawkins thinks maybe 250,000. I'll take 100,000 years. For 98,000 of those years, if you're a Christian, you have to believe heaven watched with folded arms. Most people died of climatic crises in Africa, or just watched their children die as soon as they were born, or saw them perhaps struggle for a few years. Life expectancy maybe 25.
Right.
People dying of their teeth,
of
revolting deficiency diseases, misery, struggle, famine, turf wars over women, turf wars over territory,
right.
Terror at any supernatural seeming event, an earthquake, a comet, everything a nightmare, a mystery, no germ theory of disease.
Correct.
Fear, trembling. For 98,000 years, heaven watches that, not caring, and then says, 2,000 years ago, it's time to intervene. Why don't we give God a son and murder him cruelly in an illiterate part of the Middle East?
It's tough to argue with the way he's presenting it. It's not dispositive, but I mean, you have to account for it. Well, you don't have to, but I mean, if you're going to be, say, thoughtful or thinking more about these things, I mean, there ought to be an answer for these things. And we all have our own thresholds of proof as to what constitutes an answer and an adequate response to such a thing. But what he is saying is it's difficult to gainsay. And one thing I might add, and I've said this on a couple of other videos too, is if we believe that God is a loving, caring God, and we believe in evolution, evolution is a very cruel process. And he just outlined it well, but I'm saying it's just by its very nature, evolution, because things die off. gradually grow, but through natural selection, most adaptations are harmful to its host. Most don't work. It's partly a big reason why things go extinct is because the changes just didn't work well enough, fast enough, whatever you want, however you want to depict it. But it's a cruel process. So no matter how you look at it, mankind's history is one of cruelty. And what he's saying is we're supposed to believe that heaven just stood by and watched, and somehow that's love. And there's a disconnect in the way we're depicting it. It doesn't mean there isn't a supernatural being whom we call God. I'm not saying there is or isn't. I'm just saying, as a matter of argumentation, the notion that what we consider to be a loving, all-caring parent figure who has the ability to change things just watches as immeasurable suffering takes place in the world. You know, children dying of tooth disease. Before penicillin, that's what happened. You got an infection, the fever run rampant through your body, and you died from it.
That ought to solve it. That's what you have to believe to be a Christian.
Yeah.
Well, I invite you to believe it. But I can't envy you the sheer strenuousness, the unbelievable contempt for evidence, the fantastic indifference to everything that humanity has actually succeeded in finding out about itself and its cosmos and its species, that you need to keep this little cult alive.
It's a little crass.
This is a map of world religion as it's distributed across the globe, and you can see that this is it's partitioned at the boundaries of nations. Now, I think my colleague and friend Richard Dawkins was the first to point this out. At least I'm sure I got this from him, that this is not the way truth spreads itself over the globe. I mean, this should look suspicious. I mean, religion is not in the truth business if this is how it's partitioned.
The agnostic philosopher Paul Draper has pointed out recently that if theism were true, we would expect God to act in the world in ways that science must take into account. An all-powerful being who seeks a loving relationship with humanity would probably act, in one way or another, directly or indirectly, as a causal agent in the history of the universe. And consequently, scientific accounts of that history would have to take his actions into account.
Right.
If theism were true, then, it would be extremely surprising that science can ignore God and still explain so much. And yet it does. So, the success of naturalistic science, I think, favors atheism over theism.
In any argument, any debate, the burden of proof rests on the shoulders of the person who makes the claim,
Right.
not on the shoulders of the person who doubts or who is skeptical of the claim. If I were to say, Jerry, I have invented a perpetual motion machine. I really have. It works, it's great. And Jerry were to say, I'm skeptical. Prove it to me. Can I just fold my arms and say, no, prove that I haven't?
Right. That's what I said in an earlier video too, where this gets into a problem of sort of proving a negative. And I mean, that's got to be kept in context, but it really is the burden of proof would be on the person making a claim. Now, we all have our own thresholds of proof. Some people won't believe anything no matter what. And I don't mean theologically speaking, I just mean generally in life. Some people just get so wedded to their own ideas or their sunk costs, the amount of time and thought they put into their own ideas, that the notion of jettisoning those for others just wouldn't work. But generally speaking, the burden of proof is if I say something is a certain way, I've got to offer you some sort of support, some sort of evidence, some sort of ideas that you can latch onto that says, all right, that's plausible. I can see that.
Is that the way to do a debate? Jerry and I both agree that there's a natural world, but he's making an additional claim above and beyond what we both agree with. He has the burden of proof. If I were to say leprechauns exist, and most of you would doubt it. I'm sure you doubt that leprechauns exist, but there's evidence for leprechauns. There really is. Have you ever eaten a box of Lucky Charms? There's evidence. I mean, people can draw them and describe them. So, but those of us who doubt leprechauns, are we responsible for disproving the existence of leprechauns? Can't we, as skeptics, simply say, I'm not going to believe that until you make your case? Atheists don't claim that God has been disproved, although you can disprove God in some ways. Basically, atheists claim that God has been unproved.
Fair enough.
Atheism is not a belief. Atheism is not a claim. Atheism is not a moral philosophy. Atheism is not some system. Atheism is simply the absence of theism. Okay, a primal cause is just a word. It's a philosophical word. In fact, it kind of begs the question because it assumes when you use that word primal that there was a first. So if you're asking that question, you're asking a loaded question. You're almost asking a theological question or a metaphysical question. What the questions scientists do ask is, was our current Big Bang of the current observable universe, was that caused or not? Was there something preceding that? Many or most cosmologists today are putting forth the hypothesis of the multiverse. Not that the multiverse caused, but that the multiverse allows for the numbers to be large enough for the likelihood of life-friendly universes to be high enough to allow observers like us to be there. So let's ask it this way. Jerry has a hypothesis over here.
Who's Jerry?
Scientists have a hypothesis over here, the multiverse, let's say, or there's other hypotheses, string theory or whatever, and they are not proved yet. Neither is Jerry's hypothesis proved. These hypotheses naturally emerge from the mathematics of chaotic inflation. They can be modeled mathematically. They don't break the laws of nature. They can be coherently defined in some way. Their properties can be defined. Jerry's hypothesis cannot be modeled mathematically. It cannot be coherently defined. It doesn't follow any laws of nature. It is not even on the table as a natural hypothesis. It doesn't even have a coherent definition to it. Let me just ask you, if you have both of those hypotheses on the table, which one do you think is going to be the more likely one to be the answer in the future? A naturalistic one that you can understand, that you can define, that's coherent, that can be modeled mathematically, or one that has none of that? So you're asking us to jump out of science is what you're asking us to do. The multiverse might not be true, but right now you have to agree that most cosmologists are putting that forth.
And that's where I get at the idea, the way he's using the language here, is that we have beliefs. And I don't mean we theologians I mean we human beings. We believe things. And it's based on reliability. And so even Sir Karl Popper, his principle of falsifiability and what constitutes science, it isn't that you can absolutely prove something is a certain way, but you need to be able to test things in order for it to be science. Then that leads to predictability, reproducibility, and these various things. But it gets down to what in terms of survival goes, what is reliable? What can I count on? What fits the pattern? Because we're wired for pattern recognition so that we can minimize unhappy, unpleasant events in our life and maybe even have happy, wonderful moments in life and some comforts. But we believe things where he said, which is more reliable? If you had these two models on the table, which one is more believable based on what we see? And that lends itself to reliability. What can you rely on that's going to happen a certain way and fits more a broader scope of human existence, of our daily life in various disciplines, cross-disciplinary applications. But let's see here.
As a viable scientific hypothesis, which can be testable and falsifiable, while yours cannot.
I don't know how the multiverse can be. I mean, maybe we might need the next iteration of the James Webb Space Telescope or something like that to come up with that. But yeah, I mean, I say that as a function of logic, the notion that matter came from somewhere, that's normal in human beings. We look for the genesis, where he even looked at the word primal, and he referred to that as begging the question. And it has certain implications, and not necessarily theological, but where did this matter in the universe come from? And so then the theologian would say, or the believer or the religionist would say, God. Not necessarily the one of the Bible, but God, a supreme being of some sort. Maybe he, she, or it has a name, who gave rise to the matter, spoke it into existence, did something, and boom, there it was. But then the follow-up question is, well, then where did God come from? Well, he always was. Well, okay, if God could always just be, that kind of defeats the idea of beginnings. So if God could always just be, why can't the matter in the universe always just be? Like while we're going outside how we think of things, which things have beginnings, and that might just be tied into the fact that we human beings have what we call a beginning. Like we give ourselves birthdays, we're assigned a birthday. We came into the world on a certain day. Now, birthdays are man-made constructs too. I mean, the calendar and such. The calendar doesn't exist. It's just the way, and time and clocks and all that. Those are just the ways in which we process the world and life. But it is in us, it's in our psyche to think of things. When we go into a library, and if you blindfold me and you bring me into a building, or blindfold anybody and bring them into a building and see all these books and shelves, you say, well, this was designed. So you may not even know what country you're in, what state. You might have been blindfolded for a week and they drop you off, but you still look in the structure and say, well, somebody built this. It had a designer, it had a manufacturer, all of this stuff. It's normal for us to think in those terms. And he's saying that, well, one, we can't prove it. Well, not he. I mean, many folks on the atheistic side just say, or the agnostic side say that, well, you cannot prove that. Fair enough. That's the dichotomy here, where I think it's a function of logic. And the infinite regress, if you stop at a point on the infinite regress of, well, where did God come from? Or where did everything in the universe come from if not from God? Well, then where did God come from? And then it just keeps going backward. So both have merit, but then you look at, well, observation. How reliable is what we see? And if we could duplicate it over and over and over again, it gives us greater reliability. It gives the idea, the theory, greater credibility that if I rely on this, depending on how important it is in my daily life, it will aid in my survival, either the duration of it or the quality of it. So I like to present these theological ideas, folks. And if you've got something to contribute, feel free to put it in the comment section or suggest another video that I can react to. And go from there. Have a great day. See you in another video, and keep thinking theology.